In 1984, 18-year-old Elizabeth Fritzl disappeared from her home in Amstetten, Austria. Her father, Josef, convinced everybody that she had run away to join a cult, but 24 years later, the truth would be revealed and it would horrify the world. This is Monsters. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935 in Amstetten, Austria to Josef Sr. and Maria Nenning. Josef Sr.'s last name and almost everything about him is unknown. Maria wasn't married when she became pregnant, and when her son was born, she gave him her mother's maiden name. The one detail that is known about Josef Sr. was that he was an abusive alcoholic who left the family when the boy was only 4 years old. Josef had a troubled childhood and was known to have violent tendencies from a young age. That was likely on account of the fact that his mother showed him no love or affection throughout his childhood. Another notable event that began when Josef was 4 years old was World War II. That's when Josef Sr. left to fight for the Nazis and he never returned. Amstetten was unfortunately situated where trains going to both Germany and Italy intersected, so the city was a major target of Allied bombing campaigns. After the war ended, the Russians occupied the town and were pretty much left unchecked. Murder and sexual assault cases skyrocketed and food was scarce. Maria began punishing her son much more severely. Where she would slap him before, she used her closed fist now and even kicked him with her boot. He was also sometimes tied to his bed or forced to sleep outside. Josef spent much of his free time tinkering with projects and eventually became known as the boy who could fix things. As teenagers, the boys of Amstetten had little chance of meeting girls. Due to the Russian occupation causing so much danger for any female, parents closely guarded their daughters. They were chaperoned any time they had to be out and then kept locked inside otherwise. Josef began peeping and then escalated to stalking young women. When he was 16 years old, he jumped out of the bushes and exposed his privates to a woman walking by. Soon after that, Josef left high school and began taking evening classes in engineering and supported himself with a job during the day at a metal fabrication company. He moved to Linz, 60 kilometers or 34 miles northwest of Amstetten. Over the next 3 years, Josef excelled in the engineering field, but he had still never had a girlfriend. That all changed in 1956 when he was invited to a party and met a young woman named Rosemary Bayer. During their courtship, they realized that they had similar desires in life, one being to have a large family where Josef would provide for the family and Rosemary would care for the home and children, a fairly typical setting for the time. The couple were married the same year. Despite the struggles Josef faced growing up, he managed to lead a seemingly normal life as an adult, working as an engineer and raising a family with his wife Rosemary. In an effort to save money, the couple moved into his mother's house in Amstetten. Josef would stay with Rosemary's parents during the week while he worked in Linz and then would return on the weekends. Josef's mother had a boarding house, so the couple had their own 2-bedroom apartment. The rent was just cheaper there than it would have been if they lived in Linz. The couple started off strong on their desire to have a large family. Their first child, a daughter named Ulrika, was born in 1957. They had another daughter, Rosemary Jr., in 1960, but there were complications during the pregnancy and the doctor told Rosemary that it would be dangerous to have more children. Rosemary ignored those warnings and she gave birth to their first son, Harold, in 1963. There was a pause when Josef was sent to Africa by his company shortly after Harold was born. He spent 18 months overseas with no communication with his family. When he returned, his children didn't even remember him. Despite the absence creating quite a bit of turmoil in the Fritzl household, they welcomed their third daughter Elizabeth into the family on April 8, 1966. While Rosemary was now living in Amstetten taking care of 4 children, Josef was getting into trouble in Linz. He began exposing himself to women and was eventually caught and given a warning. Then he was reported for attempting to sexually assault a young woman and was given yet another warning. In October of 1967, he began stalking a young nurse who he had seen on the streets of Linz. He learned that the woman's husband would sometimes work the night shift and that, even when he was away, she slept with the window open. On October 27, 1967, Josef climbed in the window, got a knife from the kitchen, took off his pants and underwear, and sexually assaulted the woman at knife point. Then he put his clothes back on and climbed back out the window. The woman immediately phoned the police, and Josef was quickly arrested where he confessed to the crime. Josef was sentenced to 18 months in prison, and unlike his time in Africa, he was able to see his family. Rosemary would visit him behind bars and never said a word about her husband committing a violent sexual assault. She found a job at a bakery to support the family while her husband was locked up. Once he was released, he was hired by a company that manufactured building materials in Amstetten. He told them about his conviction during his interview, but they hired him anyway because he was such a good engineer. Josef's crime was pretty much ignored by everyone, including Rosemary. She gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl named Josef Jr. and Gabrielle, in 1971. Then she had their final child, a daughter named Doris, in 1972. By then, Josef had moved to a new company where he was in charge of their Austrian division. As far as people in the area were concerned, the Fritzls were an upstanding family and Josef was a well-regarded father with a highly respectable job. They continued living in a 2-bedroom apartment with 7 children until one of the other tenants in the building passed away, and Josef was able to convert that unit into bedrooms for his children. When the tenants from the other apartment finally left, Josef was finally able to put his new plan into action. He renovated the building, adding a roof terrace, an addition with more apartments, and a cellar. Well, at least that's what he told the city he was adding, but it wasn't just a simple cellar or storage space. It was a carefully designed prison equipped with soundproof walls, reinforced doors, and even living quarters. The construction of the dungeon required a great deal of effort and cunning on Josef's part. He had to ensure that no one suspected what he was doing, so he carried out the work in secret during the night or when his family was away. Despite living in close quarters with his wife and other children, Josef managed to keep his dark secret hidden from them for decades. Once the dungeon was complete, Josef began operating it with ruthless efficiency. Elizabeth Fritzl was quiet and withdrawn. She didn't spend a lot of time away from the house or hanging out with other children. After Josef renovated his home, he began spending less time with his wife and more time in his own apartment where he was able to take advantage of Elizabeth. He would touch her and pleasure himself in front of her and then tell her that the police wouldn't believe her if she said anything. He eventually started threatening to kill her if she ever told anyone. By that time, 3 of the Fritzl children were out of the house. Ulrika and Rosemary Jr. had both married and moved out. Harold had left the engineering apprenticeship he was in and started training to be a chef in a different town. Elizabeth had a brief respite from her father when she spent 2 years away working and living in a different city, but after that, she disappeared. On January 29, 1983, Elizabeth and a friend traveled to Vienna with a plan for a fresh start away from their troubled home lives. 5 days after not having heard from Elizabeth, Josef called the police and they began searching for the young woman. On February 18th, Elizabeth was at a party when a neighbor called in a noise complaint. When officers arrived, they checked the ID of everyone in attendance, and when they checked Elizabeth's, they took her into custody and called her father to come pick her up. Just like that, Elizabeth was handed over to the man who would go on to destroy her life. On August 28, 1984, Elizabeth disappeared again. Josef reported her missing, but this time the officer told him there was nothing they could do because the young woman was 18 and could leave if she wanted to. The officer said that he could make a report, but that she likely left of her own accord. Josef went on to claim that Elizabeth had been troubled and had been getting into alternative religions. That would make people believe that Elizabeth had left and joined a cult, but the reality was much worse. On August 28th, the day Elizabeth went missing, Josef had asked his daughter to come to the cellar and help him move something. After they were done, he led her into his workshop down in the dimly lit dungeon and told her he needed to talk to her privately. Nobody besides Josef had ever been down there before, and Elizabeth found the place to be very creepy. After sitting down in a chair, Josef came up behind her and held a cloth over her face until she passed out. When she awoke, she had her arms chained behind her back and she had a gag in her mouth. She was on a king-size bed, and in the room was a television, VCR, electric stove, a sink, and a toilet. There was a metal post attached to the floor, and the chain around her arms was connected to that. This specific part of the cellar didn't officially exist. It wasn't on the building plans and hadn't been inspected by the city. To get to it, Josef had to move a bookcase that covered an opening that was only about 3 feet or 1 meter tall. He had to crouch through that and would emerge in a secret area of the cellar. In there, you were surrounded by concrete, in near darkness and almost complete silence. The second day of Elizabeth's imprisonment involved a 40-minute beating. Josef had to begin the process of beating his daughter into submission, literally. He had to break her will so that she would become an obedient prisoner. After the beating, he removed the chains from her arms and locked a heavier chain around her waist. That chain was long enough to allow her access to the sink and toilet, but it also made it easier for Josef to sexually assault his daughter, which he did before he left her bleeding and battered on the bed. He returned that same day to violate her again, and that pattern would continue for years. Josef had an insatiable sexual appetite, and he would sexually assault Elizabeth multiple times a day. At first she would fight. She would kick and punch. She would scratch his face, but eventually she learned that there was no point. Josef eventually started bringing in pornographic videos and sex toys. He would make Elizabeth watch the videos and act out what was happening on the television. After a month of captivity, Josef forced his daughter to write a letter to him and her mother claiming to have run away and joined a cult. It conveniently lined up exactly what he had told Rosemary and the police. It took a week of threats and starvation to get her to complete the letter, but when she finished, he drove 100 miles or 160 kilometers away and mailed it to himself. This partially answers the questions people have about what Rosemary was doing while her daughter was being tortured and sexually assaulted in the cellar. She's always maintained that she didn't know. She would later say that she believed that Elizabeth had run away and joined a cult just like Josef suggested, which was backed up by her letter a month after her disappearance. Some people find that hard to believe, but it is said that Rosemary had become extremely disinterested in her life and was simply going through the motions, barely conscious. In spring of 1985, Josef was tired of dealing with the chain when he was busy violating his daughter, so he started the process of making the area impenetrable. He got 2 hollow steel doors and filled them with concrete. Then he installed them over the access hole that was behind the shelf and on the doorway into Elizabeth's room. Then he used locks that were attached to electric keypads. On top of that, he told Elizabeth that the doors were rigged so that if they were opened from the inside, she would be electrocuted and gassed. That was obviously not true, but after having her own father lock her in a dungeon and repeatedly torture and sexually assault her, she was sure he was capable of anything. Of course, this whole situation from Elizabeth's perspective is nearly impossible to imagine. We only have some insight now because she's been able to tell her story. So far, I've told the story from the perspective of Josef. He knew what he was doing and what his plans were, but Elizabeth didn't. The first few days she was in shock, and then she assumed that her father was going to let her go soon after. Just before he locked her away, she told him that she was going to move to Linz to live with her sister Rosemary Jr. Josef flew off the handle, and a few days later she woke up in the dungeon. She thought that was a temporary punishment, but days turned to weeks, which turned to years. It's unknown if Josef had planned for her captivity to be permanent from the beginning or if it just became a permanent situation, but she spent a long time not knowing that freedom was never going to come. In May of 1985, Josef had finished building his bank vault-style doors and he removed the chain from Elizabeth's waist. She used her new freedom to fight him even harder and he would punish her even more severely. He would beat her so hard on a few occasions that he feared he might have gone too far, but Elizabeth always pulled through. Her will to get out of the situation she was in was strong and she fought for years, but in August of 1986, things changed when she realized that she was pregnant. Josef was ecstatic at the idea of having a new child, but at 10 weeks she had a miscarriage. The trauma of the captivity and the loss of the baby threw Elizabeth into a depression that removed all hope from her mind. She gave in to the fact that she was a slave and would never see the outside of the concrete room she called home. It was in that room, in the dark, on August 30th, 1988, that she gave birth to her first child, a girl named Kirsten. Josef had given her a book about childbirth a few months prior, and he provided her with a blanket, a pair of scissors, and a pack of diapers before she gave birth. Otherwise, she was on her own. Elizabeth managed to give birth, cut the umbilical cord, and swaddle the baby. Then the two sat in the dark in the bunker for 10 days before Josef finally showed up. Having a baby in the room didn't stop the pornography or the sexual assault. Josef would force himself onto his daughter at least 3 times a week and up to twice a day. That created a situation where Elizabeth would go on to give birth every 2 years over the course of 15 years. Stefan was born in 1990, and then Lisa was born in 1992, but by then, Josef didn't think there was enough room in the cellar for another child. Lisa was also much louder than the other 2 children had been as infants, and she cried all the time, so he came up with a plan to adopt the baby girl. In May of 1993, when Lisa was 9 months old, he put her in a box and placed her on his doorstep with a note that he had forced Elizabeth to write. It said that she wasn't able to care for the baby and hoped she wouldn't be too much trouble. She explained that she drank from a bottle and ate food off a spoon. Apparently, social services thought that it was a totally legitimate situation and allowed for the adoption. It would have been a different situation if Josef had a criminal record, but in Austria at the time, a criminal record was automatically removed after 15 years, so by then, Josef was in the clear. But then it happened again. Elizabeth had given birth to Monica in 1994, and soon after, she was left, this time in a stroller, on the doorstep of the Fritzl home. This time, only minutes after Rosemary discovered the baby outside, the phone rang and a woman's voice claimed to be Elizabeth. It was clearly a recording, and a few minutes later the phone rang again and the same recording played. That odd detail was shrugged off, and this time, Josef opted to foster Monica instead of adopt her since he would receive more money from the government in that situation. Despite not needing the money, he had grown up poor and couldn't pass up the opportunity to make a bit extra. Social services checked on the Fritzls multiple times and deemed them to be loving and caring parents, so any suspicion that might otherwise arise never did. These 2 abandoned children had fortunately found a safe place and a loving family. Lisa was identified as having a heart condition, and she had life-saving surgery shortly after her arrival at the Fritzl home. That made the situation that much more of a feel-good story that people in the area could accept more easily. But then it happened again. In 1996, Elizabeth gave birth to twin boys named Alexander and Michael. Alexander was born healthy, but Michael clearly had something wrong. Over the next day, he began having trouble breathing, and when Elizabeth begged her father to get him some help, he responded, quote, "What will be, will be." Michael died 2 days after he was born, and Elizabeth wrapped him in a blanket, waiting for Josef to return to the cellar. When he did the following day, he burned the tiny body in the furnace. At almost 1.5 years old, Alexander was the 3rd and final one of Elizabeth's children to be found on the front porch of the Fritzls' home. Once again, Josef fostered the child and increased the amount of money he was collecting from the government. By then, Josef had expanded the dungeon so there was more room for the children. He had excavated more areas than he was currently using, and all he had to do was connect the excavated areas and furnish them. He added a shower, 2 more beds, a refrigerator, a larger oven, and fans to help with ventilation. Josef continued to control every aspect of Elizabeth's life within those walls, dictating what she did and how she raised the children. He used fear and manipulation to maintain control over her and ensure that she never tried to escape. On top of that, he would come down to the cellar and tell Elizabeth and the captive children about all the things the 3 kids who lived upstairs were doing. He would bring photographs to show the upstairs family on vacations or having celebrations, and the captive family would play along in order to ensure he didn't get upset. But when Josef was away, Elizabeth made sure to educate her children of exactly what their situation was. The longest period between children was before Felix, the last child, was born. He was born in 2003, and unlike the previous 3 children, he stayed in the cellar. It seemed as though Josef didn't think Rosemary could handle another child, and the dungeon had been expanded enough to create enough room for more children. It was after the birth of Felix that Josef really started diving into a quite delusional plan for the future. He began buying property in a plan to become a property developer. He would later tell a psychiatrist that he knew that the children would become adults and would need to be integrated into society, but their isolation made it unlikely that they would be able to find jobs. So Josef was going to start a property development business where the entire captive family could eventually work. He was going to renovate the first floor of the building he had lived in since childhood into a place for his captive family, and eventually Elizabeth could return from the cult with her other 3 children, so to speak, and the 2 families could be combined. Then Elizabeth could be his secretary, and he would put the 3 captive children to work in various positions at his company. When he began making those plans with Elizabeth, of course she went along with it due to the fear she had of her father. At the beginning of 2008, Josef evicted the first-floor tenants and had Elizabeth write a letter saying she was planning to return home. He began renovations to the home with the intention to unite the families at the end of 2008, but in April of that year, 2 of the captive children got sick. Both Elizabeth's eldest child, Kirsten, now 19 years old, and 4-year-old Felix both became severely ill, and while Felix recovered, Kirsten did not. She declined so much that she began having seizures, and Josef believed he could use it as an opportunity to merge his families. On April 19, 2008, Josef and Elizabeth carried Kirsten upstairs into Josef's apartment and laid Kirsten on a bed. Rosemary was away with a friend, and the 3 other children were still asleep. Elizabeth returned to the cellar, and Josef called emergency services and told them that he had found a woman on his doorstep and she was clearly in need of medical attention. An ambulance arrived and took her to the hospital, and Josef had Elizabeth write a letter describing Kirsten's condition of the past few days, which he took to the hospital with him. While Kirsten was stabilized and placed into a medically induced coma, doctors questioned Josef about the circumstances surrounding the young woman. Josef tried to explain away the situation like he had with the other 3 children, but this time the doctor was suspicious. With very little information about the patient, the doctor thought it was possible that Kirsten had been poisoned, and the authorities were notified. Then they made an announcement on the news that Elizabeth needed to return to Amstetten, where she was suspected of grievous bodily harm through neglect. When investigators reviewed the notes that had been left with the children and been mailed, they started to doubt that Elizabeth had ever been involved in a cult. Generally, someone in a cult will make numerous references to their beliefs in any of their writings, but there wasn't a single reference to any organization in any of her notes or letters. In the meantime, Elizabeth, Stefan, and Felix spent the next 3 days in the cellar with no visit from Josef and no news about Kirsten. The discovery of Kirsten on his front porch had raised many alarms, and not just with the police who were coming to the home to ask questions, but also family members interested in visiting their sick, long-lost relative. With growing pressure and the request from authorities for Josef to take a DNA test looming, Josef decided that it was finally time for Elizabeth to make her escape from the cult. On April 25th, Josef brought the 3 captives a change of clothes and then brought them up to the above-ground home where they reunited with the other 3 children. The following day, Josef and Elizabeth visited Kirsten in the hospital and talked to the doctor, but disappointingly, she provided him with no further clues as to what caused Kirsten's condition. As they were leaving the hospital, 2 detectives arrived and placed Elizabeth under arrest. Detectives interrogated Elizabeth, trying to find out who was in the so-called cult and who helped her move the children, but she didn't have anything to tell them. They told her she was facing serious charges of neglect, and if Kirsten died, she would be charged with manslaughter, but she still didn't say anything. Then one of the detectives picked up the phone and told her he was calling social services to have them take away her other children, and she finally broke. She told the detectives that she would tell them everything on 2 conditions: that her children would not be taken away, and that she would never have to see her father again. Elizabeth spent the next hour telling the detectives exactly what had happened over the past 24 years. That her father knocked her out, and when she woke up, she was chained in the cellar. He had spent the years since regularly sexually assaulting her, and all of her children had been fathered by him. When she was finished, the detective walked to the next room over and placed Josef Fritzl under arrest. Josef reluctantly gave authorities the code to the doors of the dungeon, and there they found both Stefan and Felix. When authorities entered the underground dungeon beneath Fritzl's family home, they were met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. Elizabeth and the children had been held captive for 24 years in a place where they had never seen daylight or experienced life outside those walls. The conditions in which they lived were deplorable, with soundproof walls and reinforced doors sealing them off from the outside world. The discovery shocked not only Austria, but also people around the globe who couldn't fathom how such atrocities could have gone unnoticed for so long. The rescue operation was complex and delicate as authorities worked tirelessly to ensure the safety and well-being of Elizabeth and her children. Their physical health was just one aspect. Their psychological trauma ran deep after years of abuse and confinement at the hands of Josef Fritzl. Inside the dungeon, authorities found all the signs that a family with children had lived there. They also found pornography, sex toys, handcuffs, and a packet containing 10 tablets of Rohypnol, commonly known as the date sexual assault drug. They also found 15 notepads that Elizabeth had kept which outlined her life in the dungeon over the years. Psychologists who evaluated Josef after his arrest described him as manipulative, narcissistic, and lacking empathy for others. Yeah, no shit. His actions were deemed as stemming from a desire for power and control over his victims. Josef's psychological profile revealed a deeply disturbed individual who was capable of inflicting immense harm on those closest to him without remorse or guilt. Despite leading a seemingly normal life on the surface, Josef's inner demons drove him to commit unspeakable acts of cruelty and depravity. His ability to deceive those around him, including his own family, speaks to his skill at manipulation and control. The construction and operation of the underground dungeon were not just acts of impulse or madness. They were calculated moves by a man consumed by darkness. Josef's lack of empathy for Elizabeth and her children is particularly chilling. He viewed them not as human beings deserving of love and care, but as objects to be controlled and manipulated for his own sick pleasure. The psychological toll that took on Elizabeth and her children is immeasurable, with years of abuse and confinement leaving deep scars that may never fully heal. Elizabeth and the children, along with Rosemary, were admitted to Amstetten Mauer Clinic for long-term treatment. There were the obvious psychological events that happened to Elizabeth and the children, but they also had a number of health problems. Lack of proper nutrition and sunlight would have caused the children to not develop properly. They had also been sealed away from everyone else, not able to build up a proper immunity to most ailments of the outside world. When Josef was interrogated, he partially admitted to what he had done, but tried to minimize it with a number of excuses. He claimed that his original intention was to help Elizabeth because she was out of control. He told investigators that Elizabeth had been on drugs, and so he had locked her away to get her clean. He was going to let her out, but as time went on, it became more serious and he didn't know what to do. He said that, if she hadn't been on drugs, he would have never confined her. But Elizabeth says she never used drugs. Also, if that were the case, then why did Josef immediately start sexually assaulting her? It doesn't add up. The media dug up Josef's 1967 sexual assault conviction, and questions were raised as to why authorities had kept quiet about his past history of sexual crimes. It was also soon announced that a DNA test confirmed that Josef Fritzl was indeed the father of all of the children. In court, Josef tried to make himself look like the good guy by saying that he hadn't had to save Kirsten. He told a judge, "I could have killed all of them and nothing would have ever been known about it. No one would have ever found out about it." Yeah, what a hero you are, Josef. He testified that he hadn't pre-planned the confinement. He did it on the spur of the moment, because she was on drugs. He said he had never made any preparation and only brought down the bed, toilet, and television afterward. He said he had never used handcuffs or chains. He claimed that Elizabeth's recollection was incorrect because she had been on drugs at the time. Right. He also said that there had been no sexual assault when Elizabeth was a child, and that there was no sexual contact between them in the cellar until she had been there for 4 or 5 months. At that time, he was trying to comfort her because he could tell she was unhappy being locked up. Yeah, no shit, Sherlock. While comforting her, they began having sex and she didn't resist. He told the court, quote, "If she had said no, I would have accepted it. Like you accepted it in 1967? I think we can all see that Josef is full of shit." When the prosecutor asked him about what had happened to Michael, Josef claimed that he had been stillborn and that he had never seen him alive. He then incinerated the body. Based on the testimony of Elizabeth claiming that Michael was born alive, and based on the symptoms that she described, medical experts said that there was a possibility the baby could have survived if he had received medical attention, and that Josef was responsible for his death. At the end of his testimony, he explained why he kept Elizabeth locked up for so long. He said, quote, "I had always wanted someone there for me with whom I could exchange intimacies, a person who wouldn't be influenced by other people. What was also important to me was that Elizabeth was at my disposal for all my needs at the time. I mean, for conversations as much as sexual contact. So basically you wanted a slave that would do whatever you wanted. You created a situation where only your desires were being met. It was a perfect situation for you, regardless of how it was hurting other people. When people do that, they deserve to be locked up forever. They are and will always be a danger to others because they only care about getting what they want, even if that means destroying someone else's life." When Elizabeth testified, she refuted almost every one of his claims. That, along with the overwhelming evidence and his complete lack of remorse for the situation, made Josef realize that he was not going to win. On March 19, 2009, Josef Fritzl changed his plea to guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 15 years. In May of 2008, Kirsten awoke from her coma, and by June the doctors announced that she was doing well. They expected her to make a full recovery from the illness that had brought her to the hospital. Everything else would be handled in the long term at the Amstetten Mauer Clinic. Due to tensions between Elizabeth and her mother, Rosemary was released from the clinic in June. She began living under an assumed name. After being treated, Elizabeth and her children moved to a small town in the Austrian countryside and continued to receive therapy. Josef Fritzl was held in a psychiatric facility after his conviction, and despite him being eligible for parole, he was transferred to a regular prison earlier this year. A court statement said a release or a conditional release from prison would not be possible for, quote, "special preventative reasons." Josef claims he is no longer a danger and has no more sexual desire, but a letter he wrote to the parole board shows that he's still very much lacking in remorse. In the letter he wrote that he regretted what he did, but went on to claim that he was a good father. I feel like, and just hear me out, if you can imprison and sexually assault your own daughter for 24 years and still think you're a good father, you very well might be a monster. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.